Well, thank you all for coming to our library talk today with Dr. Dan Strange. As I've said, every time we've introduced these library talks, this is an extension of what we do at Reference here in the library, where we train people to love God with their minds, but that is not independent of loving God with their heart, soul, and strength. These things work in concert together. And so today we've got with us Dr. Dan Strange. He's the director of Crosslands Forum, a center for culture engagement and missional innovation. He received a PhD from Bristol University, and he is here to talk to us today about his most recent book, Making Faith Magnetic: 5 Hidden Themes Our Culture Can't Stop Talking About and How to Connect Them to Christ. So first, thank you for being here with us.
Not at all. It's great to be with you.
Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Crosslands Forum. What is it that Crosslands Forum does, and what do you do there?
Yeah, so Crosslands Forum is part of Crosslands Training, which has a close association with Southeastern because you accredit the ministry mentored masters, and so we have a kind of a seminary-like in context training in the local church in the UK. We also have foundation courses for people who have just become Christians and people in their churches, like Lego bricks that can support church training. But the thing that I do is Crosslands Forum. So it's kind of it's helping Christians and churches to engage the culture around them faithfully and fruitfully. And we focus on research and resources, do reading groups and short courses, and also trying to get Christians in different areas of life to come together and talk about what it means to apply the Lordship of Christ to all of life. So it's a kind of, the whole Crosslands thing is an ecosystem from conversion through to PhD and everything in between. So I've just become the director of Crosslands Forum. I was the director of a theological seminary before that, Oak Hill in London, which was one of the parents of Crosslands when it was born, I suppose.
So let's go ahead and talk about your book. Tell us a little bit about why you wrote your book. What was the motivation for it?
Yeah, so I think the book came out of, I think, apologetics and evangelism classes that I was teaching in London. And I think in the UK, many Christians are really struggling to get traction with the gospel, with the culture that we're in. I mean, I joke, but sometimes I'm glad when people are offended, because most people, just Christianity is not on their radar. I mean, I know it's, you may find that this hard to believe, but that's the case. I mean, there's huge biblical illiteracy. People don't know who Jesus is, or, it's very hard. To try and get traction with where people are at. So the book is looking at a particular theological understanding of the human person to say, this is how we get traction. The gospel is always relevant. There's always points of contact. And so as a systematician, I suppose, that's my background, it's trying to say, how can we think missiologically about how do we get that traction with the culture around us, which really seems so far from even considering the claims of Christ.
So what is it that you hope your readers get out of the book? What's the main premise or thrust of the book?
Yeah, so the main premise or thrust is an encouragement to say that what the Bible teaches us about the human person, there is always a point of contact. There's always a way in. All human beings are already in a relationship with God. They're asking similar questions. We just have to excavate those. And what I'd love is churches to read the book and come together to say, what does this framework look like for my local context? So with my theology, I suppose, I'm always trying to wrestle with two things. Strong confessional, for me, kind of Reformed confession, Baptist confession. So confession, and then context, understanding our context, where we are at this place in this particular time, knowing that Wake Forest is not London, is not Calcutta, and these are different contexts, same confession, different contexts. So how do we then kind of contextualize for where God has placed us in our very local community?
And so you mentioned five, I want to get the language right on this, five kind of magnetic points or that are in each, that are in the culture. So could you talk a little bit about what those 5 points are and how they manifest?
Yeah. So I'd call this kind of theological anthropology, really. And on your handout, this has been designed by our learning designer at Crosslands, who's a great illustrator. So really the book, I would like you to read the book, but if you wanted a pictorial representation of the book, it's on this picture. So it's saying that, and I do some exegesis on Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians and others, and it's to say that all human beings have what you might call a religious consciousness. People have been made in God's image. We suppress the truth in our idolatry, but that can never stay totally suppressed, and it always has to, the kind of our relationship with God always has to come up back in different forms. So there's these magnetic points, or you could say itches that human beings have to scratch. And in a minute we'll talk about where I get those from in terms of the person who I've been influenced by. But yeah, it's this idea, and the person, this guy Bavinck, there's 5 points, I suppose, that he says human beings always live their lives as if they're answering these points. And there's one about connection and totality. We want to be connected with other things, other people. Identity is really important. Norm, we all have a sense that there are rules that have to be obeyed. I'm not talking about the 10 Commandments, but all people have rules. Even countercultural movements have their own norms. So norms are kind of hardwired into us. Deliverance, we all think there's something wrong with the world, and we all think there might be a way to get it right, but what is that? Destiny, we know that we are in control, but we're not in control, and what does that mean? And then a higher power, is there something beyond just this immanent world that we live in? So these 5 magnetic points, now they're all, according to the different culture or the different religion or worldview or ideology, they all configure in different ways, but they're all present. And so what the book is saying is we need to work out what those points are for each person that we're engaging with, and then we need to bring the gospel to bear to show how Jesus both confronts the way we answer these magnetic points and connects with them as well.
All right, so how can Christians connect to these themes, and specifically connect the gospel to those themes and draw people to Christ by using those magnetic
So I think
points?
it's saying that your person who you're wanting to witness to, who has no interest in Christianity or anything you might want to say, we are saying they are religious people. They're always answering these points in the lives that they live, the choices that they make. So in the book, this framework has been used for kind of other religions, you could say. But what I'm trying to do in the book is say, well, in our post-Christian context in the UK, and increasingly maybe in the US, we need to do some excavation to find out how people are answering those points in their lives. So the book is trying to give examples, but these are my examples that I've seen as I wander around the objects of worship that Paul did in Acts 17. But you need to do the same, everyone needs to do the same analysis. So in the book, I describe one of the points, and then I give lots of examples that I've come across as a kind of a starter for other people to be thinking about that. And it's been great because there's an email at the end of the book where people can send in examples, and that's what people have been doing from all over the world about, I saw this magnetic point here, I saw that there. And that gives us, we're starting to read the culture theologically, and that's what I want us to do. Yeah.
So let's maybe hear about some of those, maybe even share some of the stories that you have in the book about seeing those magnetic points.
Yeah.
But what are some of the things that we haven't been able to see if we've read the book, maybe you've been emailed about? What are some examples?
Yeah, so here's a great example. There's a magnetic point called destiny. So it's this idea of this guy Bavinck, who's the missiologist who I base this work on. He has this great phrase, and you might think this about your life or people that you know who don't know the Lord. He says, we both lead our lives and undergo our lives. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we think, I've got freedom, I've got agency, I can do what I want. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, we're just victims. We're cogs in a bigger system. We've got no freedom. And people, kind of flip-flop between those two things. Now, the way that expresses themselves, and this came up after the book was published. So I went to speak to a group of first-year students at the local university where I live. And I asked the Christians there, the Christian Union, the InterVarsity group, I suppose, what are some of the things that just the freshmen are talking about? And there were two things that week that they were engaged in. The first is a lot of people are into this phenomena called manifesting. Have you come across manifesting? You know, some of you know what I'm talking about. It's kind of using crystals. It's almost that it's like positive thinking, so much so that you can bring reality into existence. So a friend of this Christian had really wanted a boyfriend, and they believed they'd manifested their boyfriend that week. So it's like a radical bringing into existence reality. So that was the one thing. So that was a kind of, we are like gods. We can bring into reality just by the power of our mind. Whatever you think about it, not much, but that's what they thought. But then the other side of it, the other thing that students were struggling with is a terrible situation. In some in nightclubs, if freshmen go out in the opening week, and there'd been 2 students that had died because of injection spiking, date rape drugs in the neck. So there was a boycott on nightclubs, and so that was a fear thing. So on the one hand, you've got people manifesting, saying we can do what we want to. On the other hand, people are living in fear, thinking we've got no control. And I think that the thing that brought it together was a number of students, like 18-year-olds in the UK. A number of them have said to me, we've been told from a very early age that we are the generation that are going to change the world. You can do whatever you want to do. You're going to change things. You're going to make things better. And then people get to university, within the first week, they realise we can't really change much at all. And kind of the disillusionment of that is very hard for people. And that's an example of the destiny. It's the kind of, do we have any agency, or are we a puppet, or do we have freedom? Now you know, if you've been doing philosophical studies here, then that's a huge question. But you see that at a very kind of popular level. And I think a lot of young people are feeling that. Apart from when I went to speak in Pittsburgh. So I did this material in Pittsburgh at a church there, and there was a guy in the church who works, I didn't realize that Pittsburgh has all these kind of high-tech companies, medical companies you can tell me about. Anyway, there was a guy who is part of the church, and he said, when I did this bit about the destiny thing, he said, you're right, a lot of people I meet do think that they don't have any freedom at all. But he says, I work with people who are young people who literally, because they are so bright and so gifted, they literally could change the world. The problem there is that they're so paralyzed and responsible that they might get something wrong, that they can't deal with it, they can't cope. So it's either you feel kind of as if you're on the bottom of a shoe and you've got no agency, or you feel as if we are godlike and how are we going to handle these powers that we've been given. So both of those are kind of the tension. So that's one example of the destiny magnetic point. And whether you think it's, you know, I can't buy a house, or I'm addicted to something, or, you know, that sense of powerlessness. And I think lots of people feel like that. Are we in control, or are we being controlled? And we flip-flop between those two things. So that's just one example of one of the points.
All right, so I'm going to go a little bit off book, but related to this, these...
You said you didn't go off book. Go on,
Did I?
Yeah, go on.
I thought I included that in the email somewhere. But no, so it's not too far off book though, but like, how do we transition if we're seeing these magnetic points? How do we transition, at least in your context and what you've seen as you travel, like from that to a point of being able to show how Christ feels those?
Great, yeah. So when we're doing our work and we're trying to listen to people and we're listening to how they might answer those points, and again, you're not saying to your person, oh, you need to show this point to me. You're just kind of listening and you're saying, I've got the theological framework here, because we think theologically, remember? This is not just phenomena. We're thinking theologically about the phenomena to interpret it. Then I think we get to a point where we realize, actually, these people are religious as much as we are. You know, that's what Paul says in Athens, isn't it? People of Athens, I see you're very religious. That's why he wanders around the objects of worship. He says, you've got an unknown God. So what we're trying to do is find our equivalence of the unknown God today. Now, Paul doesn't say, isn't it great you've got an unknown God, and really it's Jesus. The unknown God is really Jesus. It's much more, it's complicated than that, because he calls people to repentance. So this is where the idea of subversive fulfillment comes in, which is a term that I'm trying to build my career on. So this was a missionary in Hendrik Kramer in the beginning of the 20th century, when people were starting to say Hinduism and Buddhism, they're kind of Christ fulfills them. And Kramer says this is rubbish. Christ is completely different. But if you want to talk about fulfillment, you can talk about subversive fulfillment. So what we need to show people is that those itches that they're scratching, that they're living out these magnetic points, can only be found in the gospel. By that I mean the whole Christian life and worldview, and actually in the person and work of Christ. Jesus is the way that we find connection as we're connected to him. Jesus is the one who delivers us. Jesus is the one who says there is one in control, but also you do have agency. Jesus is the one who is the higher power. So that's how in our conversations, and again, this isn't a kind of a tract you give someone or a rote kind of mechanical thing. It's wisdom, it's knowing when to talk, but it's trying to see people theologically to then bring the gospel to bear, because now we see them with new eyes. Yeah, they are answering the points. And do you know what? The struggle that people have about any of these points, these can be seen to be made true in Christ. People have to repent, but they have to know how Christ both connects with these points and confronts them. And that's what the gospel does.
So one of the things that you state in your book is that our friends and our family, they don't take time to think about the implications of what they believe, or they feel those pulls, but they don't necessarily take time to think about it. They're trying to, where those pressure points come in, they kind of try and
because we are a race of truth suppressors. We try and wriggle out. It's the thing, like I was preaching on this thing in chapel the other day. We know that we need to build things to protect us, but we still want to build them because we have control over them. This is why people would much rather believe in fate than a personal God. Why? Fate doesn't care what I do. A personal God would. So do you see how the idols that we build for ourselves intellectually are actually, they kind of massage our sinful nature, and they need to be dispelled. And the way we do that is by pricking the bubble. There's that great passage, remember in Isaiah, where that's a typical passage where the idolater makes their dinner, their supper, and then they build the idol out of Isaiah says this is ridiculous. But the key verse there, I think it's Isaiah 44:10. No one stops to think. As I always say when I do this talk, your non-Christian friends and family are not in a parallel meeting learning how not to be a Christian. Yeah? They're just living their lives. So our job is to get people to stop and think. Do you know what you're doing? Do you know that this is a cracked system that can't hold water and there's a fountain of living water? So people are living in a kind of a zombie-like nightmare. And that's what sin is, isn't it? It's kind of, that's Ephesians 2. Dead. The living dead. So in all ways possible, with gentleness and respect, but sometimes we have to be, shake people out of that to show do you know where this leads? Do you know how silly this doesn't work intellectually, emotionally, imaginatively? And that's for me what cultural apologetics is all about. And it's trying to show people that actually they are under authority. They do have everyone, as Bob Dylan says, you've got to serve someone, and people need to realize that.
Yeah. So, it's very similar. We were talking about Schaefer before the talk, and what he talks about with, if I remember the analogy correctly, is removing the roof off of.
Yes, he has removing the roof, and he also has the one about bring people to the edge of the cliff and then just pull them back. That's quite a kind of a.
So the magnetic points aren't quite as violent, maybe. I don't mean that.
No, but there has to be exposure. I mean, in my previous book, Plugged In, I talk about use this structure: enter, explore, expose, evangelize. We need to enter into someone's worldview, explore it theologically. Where's the good stuff? Because idolatry is parasitic on the truth. But then we have to expose. We've got to show people that the things that we construct the idols we construct have feet of clay. And that's what apologetics for me is all about. And then when we've done that, then we have to show how Jesus is the one who both confronts and connects, who subverts and fulfills. And that's crucial.
All right, so we've talked about Bob Inc.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about him and who he is, because there's another Bob Inc. out there that
there
we're
is,
confused.
And please, schoolboy error, don't make the mistake. So The Bavinck you probably have heard about is Herman Bavinck, who wrote Church Dogmatics. This is his nephew, J.H. Bavinck. Unfortunately, his name was Johannes Herman Bavinck, so that's why I call him J.H. So he was a missiologist. He wrote what was for years the standard missiological textbook that a lot of conservative seminaries, even in the US, would have used, called An Introduction to the Science of Missions, 1960. Brilliant. Bavinck was a missionary in Java in Indonesia, and then he taught at the Free University of Amsterdam. Now, what's interesting about Bavinck is that Bavinck was a key kind of influence in the work of Harvey Conn, the missiologist at Westminster, who was himself a big influence on Tim Keller. So there's kind of a link between Keller and Bavinck in some ways. It all comes from that kind of Dutch school, and I'm very much kind of in that. So Bavinck's on the mission field, and he's saying, look, he's done his work, he's done his field work, he understands the other worldviews, he has a really compassionate heart, and he looks at these different traditions and he says, look, these religions are saying very different things, but there are these similar points, and that's why he comes up with the magnetic points. And the great thing about the magnetic points is it's not an imposition that's not scriptural, because it comes out of his exegesis, which I deal with in the book, on Romans 1 and Acts 17 and all of these passages. So it's a very solid theological structure. So again, what I've tried to do then is to say, well, we're not in 1940s Indonesia, we're in 21st century Wake Forest or London, but the same anthropology applies. If this anthropology is true universally, then we should be able to transpose it, but we maybe need to look in more creative ways, because maybe religion isn't presenting itself as much as it would be in the 1950s Java. So I've been very influenced by his work, and in fact the Page lectures, which I'm giving tomorrow, which I hope you will come to, is talking about one particular aspect of Bavinck's work called elenctics, which really is missionary apologetics. It's from the word group elengo in the New Testament, meaning to unmask, and it appears all over the place, including Titus 1:9, which is obviously important for pastoral ministry. So I'm arguing that this idea of elenctics is really important, and that we need to revive it in our seminaries. So we'll be talking about that tomorrow. And he has a big section on elenctics, which uses these magnetic points to unmask sin and proclaim Christ.
Going off book again, but I think it fits nicely here. At the end of the book, you provide an example from Spurgeon.
Yes.
And this is peppered throughout your whole book about the dependence on Christ. Could you maybe, I thought it was a great illustration of Christians' dependence on Christ in this process.
Yes, yeah.
So if you could talk about that.
So this is what this has become more and more clear to me. So the book comes out of my evangelism and apologetics classes. And one day a student put their hand up and she said, this is really good stuff, but why is this in an evangelism and apologetics class? Surely this is about discipleship. That is to say, as I apply this same framework to my heart first, that's the best evangelistic strategy. That is to say, our evangelism flows out of our discipleship. And we have to get away from this idea that evangelism is a thing that we do, a project. It's as I am magnetized by Christ, as I stay close to him, as I realize that if I'm not being pulled to Christ, I'm being pulled away by other things, then I will have much more evangelistic opportunity, because the things that we struggle with in our culture are the same. And I know the struggles that other people are going to, but I know how Christ is Lord of my life and how he has answered these points in a satisfying way. And that's why really I would love, what I do at the end of the book is to say, let's take the 5 magnetic points and let's do our own kind of spiritual health inspection on ourselves. And the Spurgeon illustration, Spurgeon preached a sermon once called The Marvelous Magnet. I mean, he took my idea. I don't know how he did that, but he must have time traveled. But he when I'm lifted up, I will raise all people to myself. And he says, look, like a magnet, Jesus is the magnet, but when you put when you can magnetize other things by sticking it to the magnet. And when you stick one thing to a magnet, then you stick another thing, and then everything becomes magnetized. So The question is, how do we stay magnetized as Christians? Because I do think that's our best evangelistic strategy. And in the book, a friend of mine read the last chapter and they said, and this was a compliment, they said, it was such an anticlimax. And I said, oh, how's that a compliment? Because the way that we stay magnetized is the normal means of grace. It's going to a local church week by week. It's being under word and sacrament. It's having Christian fellowship. You know, the church, in my mind, the illustration I use is the church is like a big army medical tent in the field of battle. And the pastors, the leaders, they're the army medics. And every week we've sent the people out and they're hungry and they're beaten up and they're disorientated, their magnets spinning round, and they come on the Sunday and they're fed and they're watered and they're pushed out again for the next week. And do you know what? 6 days later they have to come back. And that's the cycle. So there's no magic bullet at the end of the day. We stay magnetized by the means of grace that God has given in the local church. And I think that's really important. Yeah.
All right, so we're in a library, and
Yes.
so we always want to recommend books to students. What books would you recommend to students to read, either for to go deeper into your book, or just in general to understand, to be able to see those?
Yes,
dynamics
so
easy?
if you want to know more about subversive fulfillment, then my big monograph, Their Rock is Not as Our Rock, which is a big kind of more academic book, you can go and read that. If you want to read J.H. Bavinck, 2 things I'd recommend. The J.H. Bavinck Reader, which is edited by John Bolt, amongst others, has 3 books that have been translated by Bavinck from the Dutch. The one I'd concentrate on is this book called Religious Consciousness. That's the best, I think, 1 volume. I would recommend Introduction to the Science of Missions. Even though it is 60 years old, some of the things that we deal with in the missions, well, we are dealing with in the missions community, what's the role of Mother Church, you know, how do we do teaching, all of that stuff, is still very relevant, and the stuff on Olympics. And then one more recommendation would be, and it's not even out yet, Bavinck did a series of lectures which were only published after his death, and he did them in Chicago. And it was a book called The Church Between the Temple and Mosque. And Westminster Seminary Press are just doing a new edition of that book because it's out of print, and went out of print years ago. And I've done a long kind of theological essay on the magnetic points and why Bavinck's so important. And that's coming out next year. So The Church Between Temple and Mosque. So there's some Bavinck there, and there's some of my work.
Okay. One last question, and then we're going to turn it over to you guys. So be thinking of your questions at this point. But you know, in your book, you describe walking around town and seeing these examples of the culture. What are you looking for when you're just observing the culture just out and about? If I can ask it that way.
Well, I think the first thing is that, I mean, my kids, they always say when I'm like doing this to, oh, Dad, you're not going to start criticizing stuff again or making, no. I mean, you know, I enjoy cultural engagement. I enjoy, you know, hearing other people's worldviews. I think it's just always knowing that we're to be switched on as Christians, and that even those things that we think are distraction, what are we distracted by and why? And it's just knowing that even in our entertainment, it's a choice that we're making, and to always have our critical faculties on, so we don't just kind of let it wash over us. And I think it is that big idea that if we're not being formed by Christ, we're being deformed by other things. And actually, I think because of the gospel of grace, that gives us a freedom to engage in culture. I do worry that we churches, and especially I think conservative evangelical churches, sometimes have this approach where we just need to kind of, you know, shun the world. But you know, we are to engage for all kinds of reasons, mainly because we've got the dominion mandate to fill and subdue the earth. So I think that's important. I think the other thing I'd say is, I think we've become better at critiquing culture, which is good. But what are we doing about positively constructing culture? And that's where, you know, I come to the States, and I know you might moan about it, but, you know, we do not have any equivalent of a liberal arts university or anything like that in the UK that's Christian. So you need to hold on to those institutions, and we need to be training people to think Christianly about all their subjects. and what does it mean to apply Christ's lordship, because we have to do serious cultural construction. And I think if we were thinking missiologically more, maybe some of the issues that we're fighting about within ourselves at the moment would have a clearer, would be clearer to us, and we'd be able to kind of extricate Christ from culture a little bit more. So I think we just need to be critical and enjoy the creation that God's given us, but always have our critical faculties, because we're either being, why does at the end of 1 John say, keep yourself some idols? Because we know that we have a tendency to be pulled away. So how do we stay close to Christ? And that means wisdom. That's the other thing. I can't give you right and wrong. When I wrote the book, the chapter I didn't write, they made me put in was they wanted me to ask, the question everyone wants to ask is, should I be watching Game of Thrones? That was the only question that was interesting. Should a Christian watch Game of Thrones? I was obsessed with it. And I'm not going to answer that question yes or no. I mean, it's a wisdom issue. For some people, yes. For some people, no. And there's kind of criteria we need to look to. We're not to be a stumbling block. We're not to, lead ourselves into temptation, all of those things. But engaging in the culture, I do think is important. And we need to do that responsibly and collectively if we're going to pull people out. So there would just be some things, yeah.
Okay.